Welcome to Prevention Services Human Trafficking Awareness presentation. I'm Kathy Wynn, and I'm one of the prevention specialists for the School District of Lee County. Human trafficking, or modern-day slavery, is a crime involving the exploitation of someone for the purposes of compelled labor or a commercial sex act through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. It's a fundamental violation of human rights. Every year, millions of men, women, and children are trafficked worldwide, including right here in the United States. It can happen in any community, and victims can be any age, race, gender, or nationality. To be considered human trafficking, either force, fraud, or coercion must exist. Only one of these elements needs to be present. That indicates that the victim has not consented of his or her own free will. Examples of force include physical or sexual abuse or assault or confinement. Fraud could include false promises of work or living conditions, withholding promised wages, or contract fraud. Coercion may include threats of harm to self or others, debt bondage, psychological manipulation, or document confiscation. One type of human trafficking is labor trafficking, in which individuals perform labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Labor trafficking includes situations of debt bondage, forced labor, and involuntary child labor. Labor traffickers use violence, threats, lies, and other forms of coercion to force people to work against their will in many industries. Common types of labor trafficking include people forced to work in homes as domestic servants, farm workers coerced through violence as they harvest crops, or factory workers held in inhumane conditions with little to no pay. Another form of human trafficking is sex trafficking, in which individuals perform commercial sex acts through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Sex trafficking involves the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, soliciting, or the advertising of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act. Common types of sex trafficking include a wide variety of venues within the sex industry, including residential brothels, escort services, fake massage businesses, strip clubs, and street prostitution. In order to be considered trafficking on both federal and state levels, all three of these elements must be identified: the action, or what is done, the means, or how it is done, and the purpose, or why it is done. Human trafficking occurs when a perpetrator, often referred to as a trafficker, takes any one of the enumerated actions and then employs the means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of compelling the victim to provide commercial sex acts or labor or services. There's a myth that if the trafficked person consented to be in their situation initially, then it cannot be human trafficking or against their will because they knew better. The fact is, initial consent to commercial sex or a labor setting prior to acts of force, fraud, or coercion is not relevant to the crime, nor is payment. Furthermore, any minor who is induced to perform a commercial sex act is a victim of human trafficking, according to U.S. law, regardless of whether there was force, fraud, or coercion. In January 2020, Jesus Santana Perez of Lehigh Acres was arrested and charged with 2 counts of lewd battery and 2 counts of human trafficking for children younger than 18. The alleged victims claimed they were ordered to have sex with other men in exchange for drugs, the use of his car, and cash. His trial is scheduled for March 2021.
What is human trafficking? Human trafficking is modern-day slavery. It is the exploitation of a person through force, fraud, or coercion. Human smuggling and human trafficking are different crimes. Human smuggling is the illegal movement of someone across a border. Human trafficking is the illegal exploitation of a person. Human trafficking is about exploitation, not transportation. Human trafficking is a highly profitable crime. and a violation of human rights. It occurs in every part of the world, including here in the United States. It happens in our big cities, our suburbs, and even in rural towns. It can happen to anyone. Human trafficking victims can be US citizens or from other countries. Victims can be any age, race, or gender. But one thing they share is that they are vulnerable to being exploited. There are different types of human trafficking, including sex trafficking, forced labor, and domestic servitude. Sex trafficking victims are manipulated or forced against their will to engage in sex acts for money. Sex traffickers might use violence, threats, manipulation, or the promise of love and affection to lure victims. Truck stops, hotel rooms, rest areas, street corners, clubs, private residences. These are just some of the places where victims are forced to sell sex. Any person under the age of 18 involved in a commercial sex act is considered a victim of human trafficking, no exceptions. Forced labor takes on many forms, and it happens here in the US and overseas. Through force, fraud, or coercion, victims are made to work for little or no pay. Very often, these victims are forced to manufacture or grow the products that we use and consume every day. Victims of forced labor could be found in factories, on farms, doing construction work, and more. Victims of domestic servitude are hidden in plain sight, forced to work in homes across the United States. Their traffickers sometimes take their identification papers and travel documents in order to limit their freedom. They are prisoners, working as nannies, maids, or domestic help. Every year in the United States, thousands of human trafficking cases are reported, but many more go unnoticed. That's because human trafficking is a hidden crime. Victims might be afraid to come forward, or we may not recognize the signs, even if it's happening right in front of us. We need to bring this crime out of the shadows. That's why the Department of Homeland Security created the Blue Campaign, to take a stand against modern-day slavery and help combat this heinous crime by raising awareness of human trafficking around the country. But we can't do it alone. We need your help. So what can you do to stop human trafficking? Visit the Blue Campaign website to learn more about the signs and indicators of human trafficking. Share this video on social media to help bring this crime out of the shadows. Be an informed consumer. Know who makes the products you buy and the food you eat to help keep slavery-tainted items out of your home. And finally, recognize and report suspected human trafficking. You can submit a tip to federal law enforcement online or by phone. For victim support, you can call or text the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. Help us bring this crime out of the shadows and into the light. Join the Blue Campaign. One voice, one mission, end human trafficking.
According to the National Criminal Justice Reference Service, gathering statistics on the magnitude of the problem is a complex and difficult task due to the hidden nature of trafficking activities. The following statistics are the most accurate available given these complexities, but may represent an underestimation of trafficking on a global and national scale. The United Nations states that of the 600 to 800,000 people trafficked across international borders each year, about 70% are female and about 50% are children. The State Department releases an annual report on human trafficking with the breakdowns for individual countries, although it's largely focused on government actions to address trafficking. In its 2019 report, the State Department found the top 3 nations of origin for human trafficking victims were the United States, Mexico, and the Philippines. In the United States, there is no official total number of human trafficking victims, but estimates place it in the hundreds of thousands. It does not break down that figure for sex trafficking alone. In 2019, the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline worked on 11,500 situations of human trafficking. Through phone calls, texts, web chats, web forms, and email, the trafficking hotline handled situations involving 22,326 individual survivors, nearly 4,384 traffickers, and 1,912 suspicious businesses. There is a common misperception that the majority of people being trafficked in the United States are undocumented immigrants. In reality, trafficking within the United States is happening largely to our very own citizens. According to a study of the U.S. Department of Justice Human Trafficking Task Force cases, 83% of sex trafficking victims identified in the United States were U.S. citizens. Human trafficking is often confused with human smuggling, which involves illegal border crossings. In fact, the crime of human trafficking does not require any movement whatsoever. Victims can be recruited and trafficked in their own towns, even their own homes. According to the U.S. Department of State 2019 Trafficking in Persons report, 77% of child trafficking victims are exploited within their country of residence. The United Nations reports that each year, an estimated 14,500 to 17,500 foreign nationals, or people who are citizens of another country, are trafficked into the United States. Polaris believes that this is in part because there is less awareness about labor trafficking, and also because the victims, even those with visas to work legally in the United States, are likely not reporting their situations because they fear deportation or other retaliation from their employers. Florida is third in the nation for numbers of reported cases of human trafficking, and the average age of a trafficked youth is 12 years old. In 2019, there were 896 human trafficking cases reported in Florida. Of those cases, 172 were under the age of 18. 640 reported cases were for sex trafficking, 128 were for labor trafficking, 46 were for both sex and labor trafficking, and 82 were not specified.
It always kind of pulls on my heart every time I have to talk about the age, but the average age of entry is 12 to 14 years old. And I've worked with a handful of 11-year-olds. When they're 11 years old and they come into your office and they're holding a teddy bear and sucking their thumb, that really kills you because you know that they're out there and police are arresting them for prostitution. And it doesn't make any sense.
They are psychological masterminds, these pimps, at picking that thing out of that particular girl, her weakness, targeting, honing in on that, and plucking her out and bringing her into their life.
He started to get to know my interests, maybe my weaknesses, what made me tick, what made me worry. And he told me things like I was pretty enough to be a model, which I didn't believe, but it was really nice to hear. I was infatuated with MTV musicians, and I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a songwriter, and I wanted to be musicians. So he said that he knew musicians all over the country, and that he could take me to famous cities, and he could get me into famous dance clubs, and I could become an actress or a songwriter. And by the end of the 2 weeks, it sounded like a great idea.
And he told me, let's go for a ride. I rode with him. We rode around the city. And for the first time in my life, I felt like he had unlocked something inside of me. I told him about my sexual abuse. I told him about my aunt and how I had got up until this point. And it felt like I had released. And he looked at me, he said, you don't have to live like that. He said, you're beautiful, you don't have to be homeless, you don't have to keep going in and out these systems. I know a way for you to provide for yourself.
Though there is no standard profile of a child trafficking victim, several risk factors make certain children more susceptible. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reports that traffickers often target children and youth with increased vulnerabilities, including children who are chronically missing or frequently run away, have a history of sexual abuse, are in or have been in the foster care system, have substance abuse issues or live with someone who does, identify as LGBTQ and lack family support, or who have low self-esteem. Of the more than 23,500 endangered runaways reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 2019, 1 in 6 were likely victims of child sex trafficking. Due to their lack of a supportive network, runaway youth are often approached by traffickers with the promise of food, shelter, protection, or a better life. In the United States, traffickers prey upon children in the foster care system. Reports indicated that a large number of victims of child sex trafficking were at one time in the foster care system. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children believes that number is about 88%. Youth in foster care may move around a lot and are prone to victimization because no one might be looking out for them, and they may crave the attention and consistency a trafficker can provide. Another myth about human trafficking is that only women and girls can be victims and survivors of sex trafficking. The fact is, a 2016 study funded by the U.S. Department of Justice interviewed nearly 1,000 youths involved in the sex trade and found that 36% were male. LGBTQ boys and young men are seen as particularly vulnerable to trafficking. Advocates, however, say the victim's sexual orientation is irrelevant. Children are easier to control, cheaper, and less likely to make demands about their working conditions than adult victims. Traffickers prey upon a child's vulnerability and use psychological pressure and intimidation to control and sexually exploit the child for financial benefit. Traffickers may target young victims through social media sites, telephone chat lines, after-school programs, on the streets, at shopping malls, or in clubs. Danielle was a 17-year-old freshman at Northeastern University when she first met the trafficker who forced her into 2 years of sex slavery. Her mother, Jamie, spoke with UNICEF USA about the factors that made her daughter vulnerable and what parents need to know about trafficking in the United States.
She started college in September, and she was struggling to just find a person to attach to. It didn't take very long for the streets to really swallow her up. He befriended her and gained her confidence, and then it turned bad. The fear that the pimp puts in a trafficked kid is unbelievable. She was working 18 to 20 hours a day. There's no question about what the consequences are if they don't come back and if they don't have the money they're supposed to have. People need to know that even good kids from good neighborhoods are still vulnerable to this tricked environment where they're being taken off the street and put into bondage.
According to the Florida Department of Education, up to 70% of sex trafficking and exploitation begins with predators connecting with the youth online. The U.S. Department of Justice indicates that every 2 minutes, a child is trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation in the United States. Increasingly, criminal organizations such as gangs are even luring children from local schools into commercial sexual exploitation or trafficking. Unfortunately, the life expectancy for a child taken into sex trafficking is only 7 years from the date of capture. The Can You See Me campaign was created to increase awareness that child sex trafficking is happening in plain sight. Victims of sex trafficking are everywhere. Would you recognize the signs? Can you see them?
There's nothing human about human trafficking, especially child trafficking. Learn the signs, make the call, save a life.
Some physical signs to look for are branding, scars, burns, or tattoos, malnourished, poor hygiene, dental issues, avoids eye contact, bruises in various stages of healing. Some emotional or mental signs to look for are they don't trust authority, such as law enforcement or immigration officials. They're fearful, anxious, or submissive, disoriented and confused about their whereabouts or time of day, withdrawn and/or depressed. Verbal signs to look for are they respond as if coached and has a very well-rehearsed story, allows someone else to speak for them. They're reluctant to discuss injuries and makes references to sexual situations or terminology that are beyond age-specific norms. Medical signs to look for are fatigue due to sleep deprivation, substance abuse or addiction, evidence of physical abuse or restraint, sexual abuse or torture, and chronic infections and cardiovascular or respiratory problems. Learn some of the signs of what human trafficking looks like, and you may be able to help stop it before it even begins.
Today, if you saw somebody chained to a post, you would do something about it. But in the days of the transatlantic slave trade, it was a normal sight to see. It isn't as clear today of what modern slavery looks like, but by knowing the signs of human trafficking, you can help protect yourself and you can help protect others. Traffickers would often brand their victims with tattoos, using words such as daddy or cash. Trafficking victims may show sudden changes of dress and behavior. They may suddenly have possessions that they usually can't afford. They may have unusually long work hours. Victims may have new relationships with boyfriends or girlfriends that are noticeably older, and I'm not talking about a few years. Difficulty with making eye contact, especially with men. Victims may have untreated medical problems, such as cuts, bruises, burns, broken bones. They may miss school frequently, make frequent trips. Victims may be unable to speak independently. Other people may insist on answering questions for them, or even translating for them. Victims may even be frightened of authorities, seeing them as the bad guys. To request help or report possible human trafficking incidents, please call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, 1-888-3737-888, or text info or help at BeFree-233-733.
So who are the traffickers? Perpetrators of human trafficking span all racial, ethnic, and gender demographics and are as diverse as survivors of human trafficking. Some use their privilege, wealth, and power as a means of control, while others experience the same socioeconomic oppression as their victims. They include business owners, members of gangs, labor brokers, parents or family members of victims, intimate partners, owners of farms or restaurants, powerful corporate executives, diplomats, and pimps. People often incorrectly assume that all traffickers are men. However, multiple cases in the United States reveal that women can also be traffickers. Herman Walker of Broward County and Layla Frazee of Cape Coral were convicted in Lee County on human trafficking charges in November 2019. The police investigation found that Frazee befriended teenagers and introduced them to Walker, who then forced them to work in the sex industry. In another case in 2018, police arrested Angel Williams, a 22-year-old Jacksonville woman, for sex trafficking a legally blind woman. The victim had posted on Facebook asking for employment, and her trafficker responded with the fake opportunity to babysit her children. In the police report, the victim said that she and her trafficker briefly went to the same high school, so she was somewhat familiar with her and trusted her. She was kidnapped with a firearm and forced into sexual acts with men for money. Traffickers often use subtle methods of trapping and controlling people, such as isolating them from family, friends, and the public by limiting contact with outsiders and making sure that any contact is monitored, confiscating passports or other identification documents, threatening to physically harm them or their families or to shame them by exposing them, threatening imprisonment or deportation if they contact authorities, debt bondage through enormous financial obligations or an undefined or increasing debt, and by controlling their money.
Sport brings people together.
We stand with It's a Penalty against the exploitation and trafficking of vulnerable people.
Offenders will face prosecution in the United States
or their home country.
Millions of people are trafficked and exploited around the world.
If you see signs of exploitation by force, fraud, or coercion, call or text this number.
To report outside of the USA, visit makeareport.app.
Your call could save lives.
These crimes will not be tolerated. It's a penalty.
Since 2014, It's a Penalty has been working to disrupt the fast-growing criminal industry of human trafficking and exploitation. Large sporting events, such as the Super Bowl or NCAA Final Four, are prime targets for human traffickers. The same goes for other high-profile events, like large festivals and political and corporate conventions. One reason for this is the sheer number of men who are single or traveling without their partner to an environment where there is often a significant amount of alcohol being consumed. This is because the biggest driver of demand for commercial sex and exploitation is the transient male population. And these types of events require the employment of temporary workers, which is another factor that can open the door for an uptick of human trafficking. According to the State of California Department of Justice, human trafficking is a $150 billion criminal enterprise and is the world's third largest, following the sale and smuggling of narcotics and the illegal trade of weapons. In recent years, transnational criminal organizations and affiliated domestic gangs have expanded from drug and firearm trafficking to the trafficking of human beings. You sell drugs and weapons one time, but an adult or child can be sold over and over again.
They mow our lawns and vacuum our offices, paint our nails, and paint our houses. They are in the room next door, or the house next door. They're in strip malls where anyone can see them, but most of us don't, because most of us don't know where to look. Until now. In 2017, Polaris analyzed one of the largest human trafficking datasets in the United States. We took the broad concepts of sex trafficking and labor trafficking and broke them down into what they really are: criminal operations within 25 distinct businesses. Now, we know where to find them. Now we can start to understand how they got there, how traffickers work, how the businesses are run. Now we know. Now we end it.
Another myth is that traffickers target victims they don't know. But the sad fact is that many survivors have been trafficked by romantic partners, including spouses, and by family members, including parents. A 2-year investigation dubbed Operation Stolen Innocence by the Tallahassee Police Department uncovered the horrific sexual exploitation of a young teenage girl and netted a staggering amount of arrests. Defendants disclosed in sworn interviews that the mother accepted money or drugs in exchange for having sex with the child.
A major human trafficking bust today at the Florida State Capitol exposed 178 people. The arrests are part of a 2-year-long investigation between local, state, and federal agencies. As reporter Jake Stofan tells us, the entire operation is connected to a single child victim.
106 have been charged with felonies and 72 with misdemeanors in this case, including a grade school PE teacher. Police say others charged come from all walks of life.
All economic levels and backgrounds. It's very widespread.
Shockingly, all of the arrests are connected to the same victim, who was just 13 years old when the investigation began. Hundreds of pages of arrest records detail grotesque communications between the victim and alleged offenders we can't show on TV. TPD investigator Elizabeth Bascom first uncovered the victim being sold online.
The sheer number, the all day, every day, all the time solicitation and sexual activity and talk about cash for money and clearly meeting. I had never seen something just that prolific.
She says she believes these arrests only scratch the surface of the human trafficking industry in Florida.
When you can go online and order a pizza and a girl at the same time, and the girl shows up to your door before the pizza, our society is in trouble. Okay, that's where we are. It is unbelievably accessible.
While identifying information about the victim is confidential, officials told us she's on the road to recovery and doing well given the situation. We're also told the prosecution phase of this case will likely take many, many months. Reporting from the state capitol, Jake Stofan, Channel 4, the local station.
Florida ranks in the top 5 in the nation for human trafficking. Last year alone, there were 1,887 victims, 427 traffickers, and 243 trafficking businesses identified in the state.
More than 40% of children who are trafficked were recruited by family members, according to data from the International Organization for Migration and the Polaris Project, which runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Children are 4 times more likely than adults to be recruited by family. You might think that all victims are held against their will using some form of physical restraint or bondage and will be desperate to escape their trafficker and ask for help. But the truth is that individuals who experience trafficking may not readily seek help due to a number of factors, including shame and self-blame, fear, or even specific instructions from their traffickers regarding how to behave when interacting with others. And they do not always self-identify as human trafficking victims and may not realize that they have rights. Polaris data clearly shows the growing importance of text messaging as a means of communication for those seeking support from the trafficking hotline. From 2018 to 2019, there was a 62% increase of contacts received by text. This is especially important because minor survivors of trafficking utilize text more than adults do. In 2019, 42% of minor victims and survivors of trafficking contacted the hotline via text, compared to 17% of adult victims and survivors. According to Be the Light, an organization that provides education and raises social awareness about human trafficking, it is estimated that trafficking victims have only a 1 to 2% chance of being rescued. Once rescued, survivors still must face many kinds of challenges. They typically need medical attention for physical and sexual abuse, drug addiction, sexually transmitted disease, and mental health issues, including post-traumatic stress. People can get help or report a tip of suspected human trafficking by calling the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888 or by texting Be Free or chatting at www.humantraffickinghotline.org. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is confidential, toll-free, and available 24/7 in more than 200 languages. This presentation was created by the School District of Lee County Prevention Services. Thank you.